Hello and welcome back to the Accessing Data with Cursors and ArcPy overview. In this section, we are going to take a closer look at the update cursor. Remember from before that our update cursor is what allows us to update or edit our data. In database and computer science terminology, we call this read-write access. It's what allows us to both view and edit our data. Update cursor is going to return a list. So remember, our search cursors return a tuple. Update cursor is going to return a list, and the order of the items in the list is specified by the field names parameter in your statement. So whichever field names you want to work with, that's what's going to be in the list that gets returned. Like our search cursors, update cursors are often iterated with a for loop. And once again, our update cursors support the with statement. And remember, it's that with statement that allows us to ensure that all of our data locks are released, our cursor object iteration is reset to the beginning, and the use of with means that we rarely ever have to use the reset method for any of our cursors within ArcPy. Here is a detailed look at the syntax for update cursor. We're going to go through each of these required parameters and then the where clause of the optional parameter. So first here, just notice the syntax. So there's a capital U and a capital C here in the syntax. The in table, that is your input data set. That is your shapefile. That is your geodatabase feature class, your standalone table. That's the table you wish to edit. The field names are the fields that you wish to use within the cursor. What do you want to have access to? Remember, we don't have access to our entire data set with cursors because that's inefficient and it takes a long time. So our cursors allow us to identify specific fields that we want to work with, and that's where you would put that list of those fields. And then finally, you have the optional where clause, which allows you to create a subset of the records in your data set to put into the cursor object so that only those that meet that query would be the ones that would be put into the cursor object in order to have the editing done. So you need to remember that this is different than doing the select by attributes tool. The select by attributes that uses a where clause goes and does a physical selected set that gets held in a layer file for our data. The cursors are not doing that. They're not creating a selected set that's held in a separate layer file. They are just putting all of the records that meet that where clause into the cursor object so that they can be iterated through. The update cursor has three possible methods that can be used on it to either update or edit your data. We are going to focus on the update row method and the delete row method. Like I've mentioned before, the fact that we're using the with as methodology for our cursors mean that we do not have to physically get in and reset our cursor back to the first row if something were to happen, because the with methodology does that for us. So right now what we're going to focus on is we're going to take a closer look at the update row method. So you can see down here that it has an additional parameter with it. It's a required parameter. And this is going to be the list or tuple of values, the order of values that should be put into the same order as the fields. So we're going to see how this plays out with our cursor statement when we have to update the information. This is the method on our update cursor that actually does the physical writing into our table. It's when we type in and execute this line of code that our table actually gets updated. This method is used most often for the following purposes. So before we go off and use it, it's a good idea to understand why you might want to use the update row method. So if you ever have a situation where you want to update an existing field to be the value from another field, then you would want to use the update row method because you're going to update a row based on specific information. For example, field 1 needs to be equal to field 2. That would be what would get edited and written when you did the update row. If you need to update an existing field to be a mathematical operation of another field, that would be what you would use in the update row. Or if you need to update an existing subset of rows, you could either use that as a query, or you can also take advantage of if statements within your for loop in your cursor. And you can select out and identify individual records to have an operation done on them as they are cycled through in the cursor iterator If that record meets the criteria that you have in that if statement, then if it evaluates out to true, you can have something happen, or if it evaluates out to be false, you can have something else happen. So you can take advantage of your if-then logic as well. You can also update existing fields with a concatenation of other fields. So if you need for an existing field to be the combination of two pieces of information from before, then you would just do that and put your comma in between. In order to do many of these operations that we talked about in the previous slide, however, there are often additional ArcPy tools that are used in the scripts that use UpdateCursor. One here is just to check to see if the data exists. This is just a good practice. It's not required. I would just say it's recommended. So as you've already learned here, you compare the arcpy.exists with the sys.exit method. And this is going to allow your script to exit cleanly if your data set doesn't exist. So before you go and do a lot of operations on a data set, especially if it's in cursors, which you know you're going to open it for editing, it's just a good idea to know if that data set really exists. And this short little block of code allows you to do that very quickly within your script. Another here is adding a new field that you would then populate or update with information within the cursor. So if you need to add a field to your table and then populate it with something, the population part would happen within the cursor, but you can't add the field in the cursor. You have to use the ArcPy tool of Add Field Management, where you tell it the data set that you want to update, the name of the field you wish to add, and then the field type that new field will be. So this example here is going to add the text field called location to our airport's shapefile. Let's talk about, before we get into the actual coding, the typical workflow for using our update cursor with the update row method. First, you're going to set the update cursor statement within your input data set and the fields you want to work with. Second, you're going to set up a for loop to iterate through that cursor object, iterate through each of those rows that's sitting there. Then you're going to write a statement in the for loop saying what will happen to the fields as the cursor iterates through each row in your data set. And then finally, you're going to use the update row to physically complete the field updates and changes. And it's this final step that does the actual data updating and editing. Here is a short snippet of code. This short snippet of code is going to take our airport's data set, put it into the update cursor. We're going to focus on a field called state, just that one, and we have a query here. So we don't see the query above, but we just get to know that there's a query out there that has selected for some subset of our data, and those limited records are going to be what gets returned to our cursor object. For each of the rows and records that are sitting in that cursor, it's going to set up in a situation where whatever is sitting in position 0 of our tuple here of our fields is going to be set up to be equivalent to these letters AK. So what this is setting up is that for the state field, for whatever record is in the cursor, the state field is going to be set up to be equal to AK. So that's just giving it, basically typing it in, but not yet hitting return. It's this cursor.update row line that goes in and it functions off of the row. So this is the current row, the current object in the cursor that your for loop is on. It's going to update that field. So that's actually kind of, you can think of it as hitting return. That's what's actually writing the information and saving it into your table. And here I'm going to show you each of those workflow steps that we just talked about in the previous slide. Here's where they play out. So this first one here, that's where we set up our update cursor for a table and the fields. Next is where we are setting up a for loop to iterate through the individual rows and records in our cursor. Next is we are writing a statement saying what the new field values will be for that row, that current row that we're on in the for loop. And then finally, we're using the update row method to physically complete the field changes. And here is a look at the full script that uses the update cursor with the update row method. What this is doing, the purpose of this short script is to find all of the records in the data set, in the airport's data set, where the state field is blank. Once those are found, each of those records will have their state field updated to say AK. So we're once again calling on and accessing our airports shapefile within the cursor using the with as methodology. Here within our cursor, we have a field name of state, and we're taking advantage of a query. So let's circle back up to our query here. So we are storing it in a variable, which you can do. You can also just put it within here, the query string straight within your cursor if you'd like to, but it's a little bit easier to talk through and visualize in the lecture, at least, if we put it in a variable. So we have a variable called myQuery, and it holds an SQL query where state is being asked to find everything in that particular field that is blank. And remember, this is a shapefile. And we've already talked about the methodologies for querying for blank records with an SQL query out of a shapefile. And this is that same methodology that we just practiced in the previous module. So we're going to put that query in, meaning that only those records where state is blank are going to be in our cursor. So for every row in our cursor, we're going to set up to be whatever field is sitting in position of 0, which is state, is going to be the equivalent of AK. So we already know that these are all blank records. We're not going to be overwriting existing data. We're going to put in AK in all those blank rows. But we have to call the update row methodology with the row object in there in order for that to get to fully execute. So it's helpful here to look at what this a snippet of this table looks like before this code runs. So here is a snippet of this table with some blank records. So everything else in this table actually has AK in it. There are just a couple of records that don't. So when we execute this script, what you're going to notice with cursors is that there's not a whole lot of information that gets told to you in the output window unless you have a lot of print statements. If you have a lot of print statements saying what your script is doing, that's fine, but there's nothing really that the update cursor can report out to you within the output window of, say, idle or spider. So you typically have to get into your GIS data to see if the cursor has executed properly. And when we do this with this example, we see that once we open the table again, all of our records are nicely now populated with those 2 letters of AK. So this is the result of this cursor run and this cursor operation right here. Another common use of the update cursor is that combining of fields into another field, concatenating fields together. So this short script will add a new field to our data set that then populates that field with the combination of 2 other fields. And here is a preview of what that output is going to look like. So a preview of this script is that it's going to add a field called location, and then we're going to use a cursor to set up so that location is equal to county and state. So here's what the output would look like. Here's that new field there on the end called location, and notice that it gets added to the end. And then here is our field of county, and here is our field of state, and you can see clearly that location is the combination of these 2 fields. But before we talk too much about the script details with the cursor, I want to take a moment and refresh our understanding of concatenation and what it is. Concatenation is simply the process of combining elements. But within programming, concatenation is going to combine our strings and or our number elements together. Likely, you've done this already in Excel or a program like Excel where you have combined fields together. So in Excel, this concatenation is done by using the concatenate operator or also the ampersand operator. So here's just a screenshot of what that looks like within Excel. If you have these 3 fields that are first name, middle name, last name, you can use the concatenate method to then combine them, and you just list the order of your fields, A2, B2, and C2, to get this result. Or you can use that ampersand operator to combine all of these fields together to get the exact same result. So this is how you would do it in Excel. We're not going to do this in our class, but I want you to see this because if you've already done this, you're already a pro at concatenation. You also might be thinking, I think I've seen this before in this course, and you have. You have already seen concatenated strings and numbers in this course, most often when we have done print statements leading up to now. So here is a code snippet from your calculator program where you printed out a statement that concatenated together variables with additional text and separated these things with commas as you went through, and then the print statement would print all of this out, accessing what is inside of these variables. Here is another snippet of a print statement that concats information from your very first geoprocessing script, where you printed out a statement that the user could go to your workspace, added an additional text here separated by commas, and then added in the final information, which was the data set name. Finally, here's one from your dog breed function program where you printed out a statement that concatenated once again text together, but instead of using the comma methodology, you used the plus methodology. Both of these are appropriate within Python for combining information and concatenating text or numbers together. When it comes to cursors within ArcPy, the logic is very similar. However, we're going to focus on the use of that plus sign concatenator. That's what we're going to use most often, and that's what you will see people use most often when it comes to concatenating fields together in our table to populate a new field. So this statement below here, where we are using this concatenation with a plus sign and our comma here, is going to go through and combine the information for the fields sitting in row of 1, index position of 1, which is county, index position of 2, which is state, and place them into index position of 1, which is location. So let's walk through this a little bit. The following code snippet is going to accomplish the following. It's going to add a new text field called location to the airport shapefile. It's then going to use the update cursor to create a cursor object that holds the rows in the airport shapefile, specifically holding the location field that we just created in the code in the 0 position, the county field in the 1 position, and the state field in the 2 position. Our cursor then will use a for statement to cycle through each of these records, each of these rows in the cursor object, to do the following. It's going to set up that for each row, location is equal to county plus the comma and a space, state. So whatever is sitting in the county field, and then whatever is sitting in the state field. And then our update row method here is what's going to effectively hit return. It's going to be what writes it formally into our table when the script gets run. So you can see that here. So location is going to be equal to county plus our comma plus state. So here's what this looks like when you look at it in the context of your entire short script. You can see here that we've imported ArcPy, we have our necessary elements here, and we've put it within our try except block. But even more helpful for this is to look at the end result, which you've seen before, but we're going to look at it again. Now that you understand and know more about how concatenation is working, you can see here that we have our location field at the end and that it is filled with the information from county with an additional comma and space and then put in the state abbreviation there. And here is just a more zoomed in look at that location field, the county fields, and the state fields so that you can see how that is executing out with combining all of that information and how it is being impacted by this short update cursor script. All right, the last update cursor method we're going to talk about is the delete row method. And notice it's a very nice, succinct explanation. It deletes the current row. That's exactly what the delete row method is going to do for us. The delete row method is often used with an if statement within your for loop to determine if the row meets a certain criteria. So remember, this methodology, this delete row method, can only delete one row at a time, whatever is being held in that one row of the cursor object. There's no query that you're going to do that would allow you to bulk delete everything like you can interactively within the GIS software. In order to delete our records using programming code, we have to go row by row. But it doesn't take a long time because we've built this into a for loop that iterates without us making decisions, and we've built in an if statement to identify only those records that we want to have deleted. So here in this short little code snippet, we have our update cursor, again working on our airport shapefile, and we have just the field name of feature inside of our cursor. All right, so we have a for loop set up to cycle through everything that's returned. All of our records in airport with their feature field are returned to our cursor. But since all of them are returned and we know we don't want to delete everything, we need a way to evaluate whether or not we should delete a record. Well, our evaluation here is that we have things that are in the feature field that are called C-plane bases, and we want to get rid of those. We don't want those in our data set. So we're going to say if what's sitting in row position 0, so if what's sitting in the feature field for that row is equivalent to C-plane base, then we're going to call the delete row method, and it's going to delete that row. It will delete that row out of the table and delete that feature out of the GIS data set, right? They both go together. If this evaluates out to be false, this will go just simply back to the for loop and iterate to the next record. So this is how the best methodology to identify what records there are that you then want to delete. So just so we can be consistent with our other workflows when we talk about our cursors, let's see what the workflow is with using delete row. So first, once again, you're going to set your update cursor for the proper input data set and the fields you want to work with. Then you set up a for loop to iterate through all of those records and rows that are within the cursor object. Within that for loop, you're going to include an if statement to see whether or not the current record that you're looking at meets the criteria for you to delete. If it does, if that evaluates out to be true, then you're going to use the delete row method to physically delete that row that meets that criteria. If it doesn't, it's just going to cycle back into the next for loop iteration and go to the next record. Here is how each of these steps match with this short snippet of our code. The first line here is just the setting up of our update cursor with just a single field that we want to work with. Then here we set up our for loop to iterate through each of them. Then here is our if statement that's going to ask if each of our rows meet the criteria. If that evaluates out to be true, then it's going to execute what's in the if statement, which is using the delete row method to physically delete that row out of the data set. Again, if this evaluates out to be false, it simply goes back into row and goes to the next record using the for loop iteration. And here is what that entire short code would look like that accomplishes our task of deleting all of our records from our airplane shapefile that are C-plane bases. And to help you see the results, here is what the table looked like before this script. So here's a snapshot of the table, and what I want you to notice is the number of records within that table. So 221 records in the original data set. After this script runs, remember we don't get a whole lot of information from our cursor runs in the output window, but when you open up your data set, here's what you're going to see. You're going to want to look to make sure that you have fewer records than you started off with, and we do. This output data set, which is still our airports data set, remember, our edited version of our airports data set now only has 193 records as opposed to the original 221. And here is where we have a brief reminder of one of the features of our cursors, which means they are permanent. There's no undo button. So whatever edits you do in your scripts with the update cursor are permanent on that data set. So that's one reason that if you are writing scripts on data sets, it's often a good idea to create a backup copy of your data. That way, if something goes wrong within the course of you writing your script and testing it, you always have an original version of your data set to go back to. Because what the beauty of these cursors is that you don't have to do a bunch of fixes and then save it out as a new name. You can actually get in and do the actual editing on that existing data set by accessing it using the database concept of cursors, but within ArcPy. Okay, so that has been a lot of information on the ArcPy update cursor. Next up is going to be your opportunity for some really good hands-on practice using the update cursor.